I appreciate the fact you're here today. This is sort of an opportunity for us to update you on action that was initiated last summer when the whole matter of capital appreciation bonds sort of exploded onto the scene as something that was causing a lot of duress potentially for taxpayers, not only in San Diego, but up and down the state of California. At that time, I called for approximately 5 key elements that I wanted to see embedded in legislation that we hoped would come forward after meeting with Assembly people and state senators. Those included limiting the number of years that bonds could be issued for from 40 to 25, limiting the debt service ratio, the payback ratio, down to 4 to 1 or less, and also limiting the interest rates that could be affixed to the bonds that were issued ultimately, as well as inserting something called a callable feature into these bonds. There was one man who stood up immediately and answered the call, and I think has done just an incredible job of helping to bring this to the light of day at the state of California level in the state legislature. And he, in concert with several other people, have been able to craft legislation, and I am very proud to call him a partner in this venture because he has done just an incredible job. So I bring to you Assemblyman Ben Hueso, who is now the co-author of a bill, 182, and he's going to tell us about that bill.
Thank you, Mr. McAllister. And again, we have been working really hard on this for the last few months, and I'm very pleased that we've come up with a bill that accomplishes our legislative intent, which is going to be to really control these runaway caps from exerting a huge burden on our school districts. So we today introduced legislation that, as Mr. McAllister mentioned, it includes some of the features that we were pushing for. Normally, a bill is introduced and you go through the stakeholder process of getting input about it in gaining support for it. Well, we worked really hard to gather stakeholders. Everybody would really be interested in having a discussion on how these caps affect our community. We've gone to the education community, our finance community, convened several stakeholder meetings to discuss the importance of having a state initiative like this. And as we went through the process, we became more resolute in moving forward with this because we saw that there is a very strong need for this. We do have to move down in this area to make sure that there are controls placed in the future. And I feel very confident that we have the bill that addresses that, and we have worked through that process to ensure that. So I'm very proud to have a bill that's fully vetted and about to go through the legislative process. And and as we've worked on it, we've been gathering support, bipartisan support. And I always like to work in a bipartisan fashion, and this is a bill that I think will get strong bipartisan support. And it's getting the interest of other legislators in Sacramento. They're jumping on board. Of course, we had Marty Block and we had Senator Weiland and other legislators are joining on board. Joan Buchanan is a principal co-author of this bill as well. She's the chair of education. She also has been a steadfast champion on this issue, somebody that has worked with us to craft a bill that will really get at solving the problem. And with her leadership, and all the leadership of all the people that have expressed support with the bill, we have a very strong sense of confidence that we're going to get this bill adopted by the legislature, and we're working with the governor as well. The governor knows about this bill, and we feel very confident we're going to have his support as well as we go through this process. We hope we continue to gather the interest and the support that we've been able to gather in a short amount of time. We're going to have, again, a year-long process to solidify that as the legislative process begins, this month. So, anything else you want to say?
Well, I just want to add that from a San Diego perspective and a San Diego County perspective, where the Treasurer's Office does interface and does interact with school districts all the time, we manage a pool of assets here that's about $7.3 billion in size. And it's our mission to do right by the school districts, but also at the same time to do right by the taxpayers. Assemblymember Hueso's bill does right by the taxpayers, and we are thrilled that he and his co-author, Assemblywoman Buchanan, have seen fit to include 4 of the key provisions that we suggested last year. And I can't tell you enough how important they are. In fact, the #1 proviso in the bill, leading off the bill, is a 4-to-1 payback ratio. That came from San Diego. That came from the fact that we have our ear to the ground, and that's what the taxpayers said they thought was reasonable and fair. To put this in perspective, if people have a 30-year mortgage on their home loan, very often we're talking about a 2.5 to 3-to-1 payback ratio. So that's something I think everybody can relate to when they own property. And we think that 4-to-1 will give school districts a little more latitude and a little more flexibility and not cut them off from the process of issuing these, but enable them to work within the confines. Not only that, but other things contained in the bill. The last thing I wanted to mention is that this is really, and has its roots in disclosure, openness, and being available to the light of day. And this bill will see to it that school districts are held to a high standard now of having to disclose all of the fees that are brought forward in these kinds of actions, whether they are financial consultant fees, bond counsel fees, underwriter fees. All of it is going to have to be brought before a noticed, open, public meeting of those school districts because of this bill. We think that is very good for the taxpayers of San Diego and throughout California. We'd be happy to take any questions that you might have.
Assemblyman, why not limit the interest rates or require that the bonds be callable?
Why not? They are, the bills are callable after 10 years under, it'll be a requirement. So if somebody inherits one of these caps in a change of leadership through the electoral process, they can always refinance and get a better deal in the future. We thought it was very important they do that, especially if somebody's tied to a really bad deal. Especially if the economy improves, if interest rates improve, they're tied to a really bad deal. And the callability was something that we wanted to add to it because it's so important.
So this bill does allow for that.
It does require that
Yes, it does.
the bills be callable. Okay.
After 10 years.
And what about the interest rates? Why not legislate for a cap on interest rates?
We did. There's an 8% cap on interest rates.
Oh, okay.
A lot of people at home, and we were just in Poway talking to some folks, and they want to know, why was this even allowed to happen? Why did the law prevent this from happening before?
You know, it's hard to speak of why people haven't taken action before. All we can do as public officials is respond when issues arise. And there is a question of responsibility, I think, that goes back to the school boards and the school administrations involved, the school district administrators, and also the outside consultants that give advice. Theoretically, these people should pay for independent advice and obtain all kinds of options when they do deals like this. There are other school districts in the county of San Diego that have issued bonds, capital appreciation bonds, in the same time frames and have much lower payback ratios than that district did. So I think it's almost inexcusable what happened there, and frankly and sadly, long-term, because there's no out clause for them on that deal, in 20 years, when all of that money comes due and payable, that could fall onto the backs and the shoulders of taxpayers in that district, and it could result in higher taxes for all of them.
And when a bond is passed by the voters, I think the objective of the school district is to actually implement the bond and cash in on the bond and deliver on the promise of building facilities. And often that becomes, in the instance of some examples where not the entire bond was a cap, some portions of it are, and that ends up something, and for a small amount or percentage of the capital appreciation bond, I mean, a smaller portion of the entire bond ends up being more expensive than the other provisions of the bond. And because there's, in some instances, conditions in the market or other extenuating factors that compel them to want to get the money most, in a most convenient way. And this caps can be very appealing in certain circumstances, especially in certain political circumstances. And that's why this bill is necessary. Because if we continue to leave that loophole open, people are going to exercise their option to bring in a heavy burden to their district, because, you know, they're kicking the can down the road 20 years and nobody's going to be around that's really going to judge them as elected officials 20 years down the road. And that's just it's just bad public policy. It isn't prudent, and often it can potentially, we've talked about how it could lead to tax increases without people actually even taking a vote. And that's just something that was not good for the system. It leads to erosion in the public's confidence in the government, which is not good for the system. And it can jeopardize districts that are doing healthy business and doing things the right way from getting the support of their electorate to replace our schools through the bond process, because people are becoming more fearful that government is not being prudent, making wise decisions. So
I think it's hard to legislate morality or reasonableness. You expect that in public officials, and you expect that in public administrators who administer these school districts to step up and do the right thing in the first place. And that's why there was no legislation previously, because I think people assumed people would do the right thing. And in most cases, they do. In many cases around this school community in San Diego, there are 42 public school districts. In my efforts to get out to meet with every school district and every board of trustees, we have seen school districts that have been given the option, like last night, I was in the South Bay Union School District board meeting. They had the option to issue cabs 5 years ago, and they refused. They decided that it was not worth the risk to issue cabs. In the Lemon Grove Elementary School District, their ratios are 2.3 to 1 and 3.4 to 1 in terms of a payback ratio. They're done responsibly. And I think, as Assemblymember Hueso points out, cabs are not necessarily bad in and of themselves. And when they're part of a well-managed portfolio of bond issuances, the reasonable test is applied and it passes the test. But it's when people want too much too soon and then decide that they're going to just roll the dice and fund it up and promise no payments for 20 years, that's almost too hard to believe. And our thought is, when it seems too good to be true, it probably is. And people should ask questions.
And we saw some districts that actually did use cabs responsibly that fell within the guidelines of this bill. So cabs can be a useful tool, and if the district does its due diligence and goes to the extent of trying to get a good deal on a cab, this bill would not preclude them from getting a responsible cab.
Can there be a situation, though, emergency or something, where they might need to exceed the limits of what's in this legislation? And what do you say to a school board member, for instance, that's concerned that this legislation would take away their ability to deal with that situation?
Well, again, the consequences of a situation, I mean, those instances are very rare. We haven't really seen an instance where somebody actually gets a cab through an emergency. So it would be a first, but even in that, we have to decide, you know, to what extent is legislating for the emergency more important than legislating for an instance where, you know, there's a practice that's contributing to the erosion of public confidence in bonds as a whole. And we have to protect the bond process because, like you mentioned, largely people are responsible in the way they pursue bond financing, and you know we can't punish them for that.
And I should add, under this bill, they were careful enough to include a requirement which will require any district issuing cabs to do a written evaluation comparing what current interest bonds would be in terms of charges and fees to the district versus cabs for the district. So it will force them now to do something they've never been forced to do before, and we think that is good for business, good for the schools, and importantly, more importantly, probably good for taxpayers.
You called for also having maybe another governing board or another agency, superintendent of county schools or supervisors possibly looking at it. Okay. Hopefully I get this one. That one is not in the bill, correct? That's the one that's missing. Why not go to that actually?
We try to, you know, there are some instances that make sense for some people like San Diego. In other parts of the state, it doesn't make sense. We thought that a standalone bill guiding the process wouldn't necessarily put a burden on another agency and expose them to a liability, saying the onus falls on you. If they don't have the staff or the capability to review it or stay on top of all of that, we don't want to necessarily burden it creates more of a bureaucracy. We thought a standalone bill would be more effective at guiding the process, so there could still be stakeholder input, but creating a framework by which people have to abide solves that problem, and it eliminates the need for oversight and doesn't necessarily put a burden on a local agency to provide that oversight. But he mentioned increased disclosure. That was something that we heard from stakeholders about. Adding disclosure to the process is also going to help, make sure that the electorate is informed, that the stakeholders are informed, and people understand what they're signing up for in advance of those decisions.
And if I could add too, I think checks and balances is what this bill's about. It's going to give us new checks and balances, which will supersede and far and away, I think, be better than even that one piece of what we had thought before. I should also take a moment to say that the state treasurer has been tireless and relentless in his pursuit of making sure that there's reform brought to this whole issue of cabs. So Treasurer Lockyer deserves praise for that.
Yes, I forgot to
he
mention
also,
the treasurer.
his office has had input in a collaborative way onto this bill.
And some of his recommendations were incorporated in the bill. And, we're very pleased to have him have recommendations that mirrored our very own. So that gave us a lot of confidence that we're moving in the right direction. And after our stakeholder meetings, involving the state treasurer in this process, has been very helpful and very productive.
So this bill doesn't do anything to change the terms of bonds that have already been issued?
It's very hard to do a retrofit onto bonds that have already been issued. This is prospective, and once it's passed and once it's signed into law, it will apply to all future bonds issued. What we would recommend now is that they have the primer in all the school districts. They will have it by probably tonight or Monday morning. And if they want to issue cabs during this so-called moratorium time that has been talked about, they ought to use this as their guidepost, because that will bring light to this otherwise pretty bleak and dark area that some of these districts have been allowed to operate in.
What should people do? What should people do who are particularly in Poway, who are stuck with this huge bill? Some of them don't even have kids in school anymore.
Well, I think that the power of the people is unparalleled in our history for having an impact on what elected officials and others do. And many times there is the right of the people to vote for or vote out certain elected officials. I'm not advocating that in this case, but I am saying that the people need to stand up and be heard on this matter and this issue. It's one thing to be angry, and it's another thing to take action when you have that anger. And I think people need to be fired up about this, because I think there has been some misleading going on here. It's not an illegal thing. Nobody has ever said this was illegal. But what we're saying is, how moral can it be? How responsible can it be to issue this debt and have it fall then not only onto one generation or two generations, but maybe 3 generations down the road? That's not fair.
But isn't that's what's shocking about it? Is
That's
that
what's
this
shocking.
practice is legal right now?
Well, I suppose you could argue that, sure. It is, but that's what this seeks to remedy. And as soon as this problem has come to light, we've sought legislation to try to remedy the problem and to try to bring light to this subject. So I think it's good.
Any pushback? Have you received any pushback? What are folks saying critical of the bill?
I think there'll be pushback. That's okay. That's okay that people fight for what they believe is good for them. But generally, I think this is a bill that's good for the whole. It's for the greater good of all our communities and the process.
Have you already received some criticism or pushback from school districts concerned about having the financing powers limited?
Well, not yet. Not yet. I'll tell you, I haven't received anything formal. I've heard comments from people out there that that have representatives that went through this process that are would rather see a different approach or a different strategy be used. But I think we got it. I think this is what we need to do. This doesn't preclude cabs from happening. So if they say it's going to kill cabs, That's not true because we have examples of caps that have been issued under these parameters. So, but you know, it will preclude those grossly unfair caps that are just putting a huge burden on on districts well into the future. And that's what we're trying to achieve.
And I think too, it's important for people who have made mistakes to step up and admit they made mistakes before they can move on. And it seems to me that there's a lot of not admitting mistakes going on in some of the arguments back that we've heard from districts throughout the state. We heard of one district, Folsom District in Sacramento, for instance, that has a 19-to-1 payback ratio. Outrageous, outrageous. But at what point does it stop? This will put a stop to that, and we are hopeful that it will put it under control and make things work a lot better for the benefit of the taxpayer.